Welcome to Bigfoot Society. If you have Bigfoot activity to report from the same areas discussed in this episode, please reach out to me directly after this episode. And if you'd like to be on the podcast to discuss a personal Bigfoot encounter, please reach out to me directly at bigfootsociety@gmail.com. Do you wish there was more Bigfoot Society to listen to every week? Well, there is now. If you become a supporting member over at Patreon, you get a special members-only episode every single week on Wednesdays, and sometimes even more episodes. Head on over to patreon.com/the Bigfoot Society. And now let's get on with the show. All right, Bigfoot Society, we've got the privilege of talking to Rob today. Rob's an individual that I reached out to, I believe, and asked him to come on the show. He's got an interesting background. He's a 71-year-old lifelong resident of Washington State. He's a hunter, fisherman, outdoorsman, and a member of the BFRO. So he's been involved with some very interesting things. So we were kind of chatting a little bit before the show started, but welcome to the show, Rob. How's it going today for you?
Thanks, Jeremiah. Very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a great day when I'm able to talk to some people about Bigfoot. I can't beat that. So I'm just excited to have you on so we can have this conversation. But you know, Rob, when I have a researcher like yourself on the show, I always like to start with, you know, what was it that first got you into the passionate search for Bigfoot along the years?
Okay, well, the story gets a little bit in-depth, but I'll try to condense it as much as I can for you here. Let's see, gotta go back here. 1967, some friends of mine and I had little trail bikes, Honda 90s, Yamaha 80s, that kind of thing. And we were growing up in Seattle, no place really to ride them. But I had spent a lot of time up in North Bend, Washington with my dad, fishing the little rivers and streams and ponds and grouse hunting and all that up there. And it was an ideal place to go ride these little bikes. So a couple of us talked our dads into loading up trucks with these little motorcycles and taking us up for a nice long weekend in July of '67. So there were four of us with motorcycles. One guy didn't have one. We all agreed to take turns carrying him around. And our parents dropped us off and we rode around for a little while and found a good camp spot. Now, I should say that the area was supposedly closed due to fire hazard, but you know, we were kind of scofflaws and we could tuck the little motorcycles underneath the gates quite easily. So we kind of set up stealth camp down this dead end, old abandoned logging road and into the trees where we couldn't be seen. We didn't have campfires or anything like that. But one of my reasons for wanting to go to that location was up on top of Mount Si, which people in North Bend or on the east side of Lake Washington would be familiar with. On the top of Mount Si was an old beaver pond with a creek flowing out of it, and that creek always had a nice population of little cutthroat trout in it. So I wanted to take the guys up there and go fish that. So we were camped actually just down by where that creek flows off the top of the mountain and goes through a little waterfall and collects and runs into the Snoqualmie River. So our first night was pretty uneventful, and we get up that morning and we decide we're all going to go up the hill and go up to this beaver pond and do some fishing. So we ride the motorcycles up there. We kind of stuff them off in the bushes. We go through this little trail. It's only about 25, 30 feet long to get to the creek. And we get to the creek and we rig up our fishing rods and we're all kind of spreading out along this creek and, you know, just using a single salmon egg to kind of plunk along these little holes. And I'm working my way downstream and I get to a point where I'm probably maybe 125 feet from the next nearest buddy of mine. And I'm just about to drop my line in this little hole when there was this absolutely ear-splitting, guttural, screaming, growl kind of noise. I just really can't even describe it. It was just so alarming and it was so loud and it just shocked me. And I stood there kind of looking around trying to get my bearings and understand what had just happened. And then just panic overtook me and I raced back up the creek to where my buddies were. And the four of them were standing there all together. And those who had pocket knives had their knives out and they're all staring at this hillside in front of them. So of course I get there, and the usual thing. You guys heard that? Where is it? What was it? And they all heard it. And I'll start talking back and forth about what is it? Don't know, can't see. And we're looking over this hillside in front of us. It's been logged off, and there's a stump all bleached out white. On top of it is like a salmonberry bush, and we see this big brown arm come out, kind of sweep the bush to the side a little bit. And as it did that, this head appeared from behind the stump, peeking up over the top of the stump at us. And it did that a couple times, and we're just shocked. I mean, no idea what this might be. So after probably 15, 20 seconds of this going on, one of the guys jumps up on this big rock beside us and starts waving his arms and yelling. And when he did that, this thing stood up, and it was monstrous. It was just this giant, hair-covered, 9-foot-tall bodybuilder-looking kind of thing, standing behind this stump and staring at us, absolutely motionless, just staring straight at us. And we had never seen or heard of anything like this before. I think the closest any of us could come to describing it was not long before we'd all been spending the night at my buddy Rich's house, and we had watched the old Peter Cushing movie about the abominable snowman. And one of the guys said, "Well, it's an abominable snowman," and the rest of us are like, "No, those things are white. This thing's dark brown. What is this?" And it's just standing there staring at us. So finally, one of the guys has had enough of it, and he jumps up and waves his arms and does this big kind of scream back at it. And it stood there and looked at us, and then it turned to its left and walked off. And it was probably about 50 yards to get into the trees across this old clear cut. And it just walked straight off into the trees. And that's, we didn't hear anything more from it. So we decided that getting the heck out of there was the best decision we could make. And we literally ran back to the motorcycles and took off. And I don't think we stopped to catch our breath or talk again until we were about probably 10, 12 miles down the road from there. And then the agreement was we needed to find a place to stay and try and find a place where there were other people, which was quite hard to do because, again, Weyerhaeuser had shut down the whole area due to fire danger, and we had snuck in. And long story short, we did finally find a guy and two girls that had a camp set up, and the guy had a rifle, and so we decided to camp with him, and the next day we made our way home. So that was our first big event, and we talked about it for years afterwards, and I talked about it with my dad and my grandfather, and they were both big-time outdoorsmen. My grandfather had probably roamed just about every square inch of the state in his lifetime, and nobody could tell us what it was we saw. No one had ever seen anything like it. And so that went on for a little ways, and then we just kind of let it go away. And then probably in 70 or 71, my mother found an article in a newspaper about some guys going to a public library on Mercer Island, and they were doing a presentation on Sasquatch. So, okay, that sounds good to me. Let's go see what this is all about. So I went to that thing, and these two young men were talking about I don't think the term Bigfoot was being used quite then. Again, this has been 72, 73. But they were talking about these Sasquatch that were known to be in California and British Columbia and probably parts of Washington. And what they were saying was quite fascinating. And they made reference to a gentleman by the name of John Green. And they were selling copies of his books there. And so anyway, kind of logged all that into my memory banks there and went on about it. And then I finally looked up this John Green. And I wrote him a letter and said, "Hey, I'm really interested in talking to you. This happened to me if you want to know about it." Long story short, he had a friend who lived in Bellevue. He set me up with him to go tell him my story. He'd record it for John Green, and John Green could decide what he wanted to do with it from there. So I met this gentleman. He was probably a little older than my dad, and he was kind of a pseudo investigator for John. He'd take some reports down here in the Seattle area. And apparently he thought I was credible enough that the next thing I know, John Green is calling me in saying he's coming to town. We'll meet at this mutual friend's house, and he wants to take my story. So at that point in time, I show up at this house. I meet John Green. John Green has brought with him a movie projector, and he has his copy of the Patterson-Gimlin film. And probably one of the best nights of my life was sitting there at Nick's coffee table or dining room table, drinking coffee and watching the Patterson-Gimlin film, that John had on this projector. And John would run it back and forth, and we'd stop and talk about motions and movements. And I was hooked. That was it. That's all I needed. I was suddenly a firm believer in Bigfoot, that this thing was real, that it was what I had seen, and I needed to know more. So I agreed to work for John Green and take reports from the Seattle area, doing follow-up investigations on them. And that's what I did for a number of years until career path and other obligations took me kind of away from the subject. As much as I wanted to spend on it, I couldn't.
Rob, what a fascinating intro. I do have a few questions for you about that.
Sure. Yeah.
The two younger gentlemen doing the presentation, was that Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin?
It was not. No,
Okay.
I later met Roger Patterson and I've subsequently met Bob Gimlin, of course. But no, I don't know who these guys were. I never ran across them again. It was just my mother had seen this article in the newspaper about this presentation, and so I went, and I never met him again or knew anything about him.
That's really interesting. Kind of a mystery. I wonder if anyone has any ideas. We'll see. But also, who was the gentleman that was working with John Green that you talked to initially?
Oh, his name is Nick Carter.
Okay.
He was a expat Canadian, and I think that's what he had mostly in common with John. But Nick also fancied himself an outdoor writer, and he'd written a book, and he'd confabbed a bit with John Green on bits and pieces of the area around Harrison Hot Springs that Nick really wasn't familiar with, but John was, and I think that's how the two of them really got going together. Or having Nick kind of do the filtering of stories or accounts, here in the U.S. or at least in Washington State.
Going back to your initial sighting, a few questions about that. From what you saw, you'd mentioned that you did see the head a few times around the stump, and from what you saw, would you describe it more as something that was ape-like or human-like, or maybe just something completely different?
It seemed to mostly be a combination. It definitely had a conical head. That was very pronounced and obvious. It had a very heavy brow ridge, but not really like a gorilla's brow ridge. It was somewhere between a gorilla and a pronounced human brow ridge. But the musculature of the thing was just off the charts. The shoulders had to be 4 to 4.5 feet wide. It was probably close to 9 foot in height. In fact, later on, I went back. John Green asked me to go back up and spend some time investigating the area, see what else I could dig up. So I did, and I measured the underbrush where this thing had been standing, and John transposed the height of the brush to where I saw the brush coming to on this creature and determined it was 9 feet tall. Shoulders probably 4 foot in width. It just big, massive thing.
You were able to see it move across to the tree line that day, and then you have also seen the Patterson-Gimlin film as well, you've mentioned. Did you note, were there any similarities between the two different things you saw, or was it something completely different from Patty?
No, I'd say it's exactly the same thing as Patty. They're a little bit larger, and I think the stride was a little bit longer than what I saw from Patterson-Gimlin film. But other than that, pretty much the same thing.
Did you notice anything unique about its gait as it walked across to the tree line?
Just that the way it moved, it seemed to really float more than anything. When a human walks, there's that little bounce as one leg transitions to the next one, to the next leading leg. There's kind of an upward rise. And this thing didn't. I mean, it was almost like you could have set a glass of water on its head and not spilled a drop as it walked.
The scream that you heard that day, have you heard anything else that comes close to that scream?
No, never. And I have checked every source that's ever come down the pike since that time, and there's never been anything just like it.
Okay. And I'm sure you have gone into animal databases and listened to all sorts of different animals, and nothing comes close, you're saying?
Yeah, I think that we were all pretty much in common with thinking that it sounded like it was a mixture of an elephant trumpeting and a lion's roar, which would seem to be quite impossible to blend the two, but that's what we came away with describing it as.
That's very interesting. That is a description that I get in my emails a whole lot. It's just one of those things. It shows up every once in a while, and man, I don't know what I think about it. But it's just a very weird thing, right? But people are hearing something similar to what you just described. Was there a catalyst event then that got you back into the Bigfoot research field?
I think probably, yeah, there was. When John Green met with me, he asked me what it would take for me to be able to go back up and spend maybe a week up there. And I said, as menial as it is a new job I'm on. I don't want to give it up and not have that source of income to go spend time. So he ended up giving me 10 copies of each of the 3 booklets that he had in publication at the time, and with the intent that I would sell the booklets, and that would give me the money to go up and spend more time back up in the North Bend, Mount Si area. So it took a couple of months, but I did manage to get those books sold off, and a buddy of mine and I decided we'd pair up and go back up there and spend time hanging out and see what we could find. And we did find more footprints. The best one was unfortunately in a little drainage ditch on the side of the road coming down the hill, and so there was no possibility of casting that. I did photograph some other ones down lower in some leaf duff, but other than that, we didn't find anything more at that time in that area. And so I'm sorry, I kind of forgot what your question was as I started to ramble there.
No, that is extremely interesting, and we'll swing back around to that in a minute. But I'm sure that the fact of the story of probably selling those books was probably interesting in itself. Did you just randomly go up to people, or you had people that you knew that were into Bigfoot? Hey, maybe you'll like to check this out, or?
Well, I was still in high school at the time. Excuse me. And so I was trying to sell them among my friends, and I actually sold a set of books to my American history teacher. She was interested in the subject. So yeah, I was just selling them to fellow students.
Oh man, imagine if you had those today. Well, you may have some, but those are pretty.
2 of them. I can't find the third. Yeah,
those are pretty hard to get. Maybe out there they're easier to get, but I'm in Iowa. They're hard to find out here, of course. But what were the dimensions of the tracks that you had found that day?
The track was about 18 inches in length, and measuring across the ball of the foot was about 9 inches. And then the heel was about 4.5 inches around the back of the calcaneus bone there.
It's very interesting. So then after that, what happened there? Were you then back into the subject from there on out, and you were going out and looking and?
You know, I tried to back away from it a little bit. It was kind of interesting because when my buddy and I were up there for that week, um, trying to fulfill the obligation to John Green, we met two guys in a Jeep. So backing up a little bit, I was afraid to go back in the woods again after this event occurred. John Green, after meeting him, and he tells me what these things are in his best opinion, but he also tells me one needs to be shot in order for science to validate the existence. Then suddenly I was good with that, and I carried my hunting rifle. And so my buddy and I, back to this trip, my buddy and I are walking down the road back to his car, and we're carrying rifles, and these guys in the Jeep pull up and say, well, what are you guys hunting? I said, well, you wouldn't believe us if we told you. And they said, well, no, there's nothing open. There's nothing, it's not deer season. And I said, no, we're actually, we're hunting Bigfoot, Sasquatch. And this guy says, oh, well, man, you got to go to Lake Fontal outside of Duvall. A friend of ours had a cabin up there, and he had one walk by and look in his window at him, and that's a great place to go. So that gave us a new place to go hang out. And so after this stuff with John Green, John would call me periodically if he had a report that he wanted to follow up on down here in this area. I'd go do that. Do a tape recording of the interviews or whatever the person was willing to do, and get the information back to John. But that was kind of the momentum. And now all of a sudden, my group of friends are getting interested in this, and we're going out and looking for Sasquatch in more areas, and had some interesting experiences at that remote lake out in Duvall, and just kind of branched out from there. I'd hear something from somebody, usually the friend of a friend kind of thing. If they found out what I was interested in, they'd say, oh, you need to talk with my brother-in-law. You need to call my cousin. He saw something over on the Olympic Peninsula. And, just kind of kept me bouncing around looking.
Yeah, and that's how it goes with this whole subject. It feels like, at least to me, you just you start going down these little rabbit trails, and then someone just gives you some info, and you're on another rabbit trail, or you're looking at one area a different way, and it's a really fun time. I really enjoy it. It really scratches the itch that I have in my brain. So I cannot complain. And so I love doing it. What was the weirdest thing that you experienced up at Lake Fontal?
So we went camping up there. I had my girlfriend with me and two of my buddies. I had my female German Shepherd with me. My girlfriend had her Norwegian Elkhound with her. We were camped on this little knoll about halfway around this lake. The lake had at one time been the exclusive property of a Seattle men's club, and it was kind of their retreat. They used to have the lake stocked with rainbow trout. And then in later years, the Archdiocese of Seattle acquired the property, and they used the old resort as kind of their retreat facility, but they left the access to the lake open. So anyway, it's my girlfriend and I, our two dogs, and two friends of ours, and we're halfway around the lake. There's a little bit of a knoll there that was flat on top, and we were set up for camping. And it was too hot that night. I couldn't sleep in the tent. So I went out and strung my hammock up and was laying in my hammock, and my female German Shepherd, as usual, by my side. She was laying underneath my hammock. And I woke up to the sound of something, moving around in the bushes. You just hear limbs swishing back and forth. And I wasn't sure what it was. And so I sat up and turned on my flashlight and looked over at kind of this little bit of a hill. And I could see my girlfriend's Norwegian Elkhound, and he would charge into underneath this cedar tree, and he'd kind of swirl around in there, and he'd come back out, and then he'd go back in at another angle. And he was playing with something down there, and I don't know what it was. But my German Shepherd wasn't moving. She was standing there, ears at full attention. Her hacks were up. She wasn't going to leave my side for nothing. So I woke up my buddies and I said, "Hey guys, something happening just over the hill here. And, my girlfriend's dog is going in and out of this brush, and I don't know what it is down there, but there's something in there playing with the dog." So we decided we were going to try and approach it. The trail we came in on paralleled the lake shore, and so two of the guys decided they were going to go up onto the trail, and I was going to take my dog and go down into where whatever this was, and follow it, or try and chase it out to where they might be able to see it, because the woods were much more open on the trail that they were walking. So we all started down and on in. And as I was walking through there, my dog was staying, my German Shepherd was just tight at my side, hacks up. She was on alert, moving very stealthily. But as we were going through, I could see tree limbs in front of us coming back into place after they'd been pushed aside, but I couldn't see anything itself, just the motion of these tree limbs. Well, I knew that very soon we were coming up into an area that was just a bunch of old rotten alders, and visibility would improve greatly. So I just kind of kept pressing on. My buddies are still coming down the trail, and all of a sudden, whatever it was in front of me just exploded out of there. Just boom, busted out of the brush and took off running. Well, I knew it had gotten to the clear cut, and it was trying to get across the clear cut. So my buddies heard that, and they started running down the trail, hoping to cut this thing off, and I'm trying to beat feet through the brush behind it. None of us caught sight of it or caught up to it, but we could hear it running off through the woods. So the next day, daylight, well, actually it was just later that day, daylight, we went back up on the trail and tried to follow this thing. And I don't recall what the track size was, but we did find some big tracks. But in the trail, in the path that this thing had taken, was a big old Douglas fir that had fallen down, as they do when they get too large. And the top of the tree was about 4.5 to 5 feet above the ground. And whatever this thing was, it had put 1 foot down on the ground in front of the tree, and then leapt up and over this tree, which was to the top of the tree, was about 5.5 feet high. It had cleared that tree and come down on the left foot on the other side of the tree. I mean, it just made this running jump over this big doggone tree, and it continued off through the brush. So, and again, the track was visible enough, or at least identifiable enough, to recognize it as kind of a human-shaped foot, but considerably larger. I don't think I know we didn't measure it because we didn't have anything to measure with, but I remember it was well beyond the norms for a human-sized foot. And there wasn't anybody living back in there at that time. There were no houses or anything else back there. So it was just really a curious thing that it stayed around playing with the dog, and then it ran away from us little people.
It's really interesting, especially, you hear reports over the years about supposed interactions with dogs, and you do hear some really interesting things. So it's not surprising. It is interesting the way that the two different dog breeds were reacting.
Yeah.
Myself, my first dog was a Norwegian elkhound, so I can really picture it. And it would get into some issues, the porcupine quills in the face down by the reservoir and things of that nature. But I could totally see how that dog was definitely going after it. So how old were you during that encounter?
Let's see, that was 18 or 19.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's really cool. So then when did you start to link up with the BFRO? Is that quite a time jump to get from, your early 20s to when you linked up with the BFRO?
Yeah, that was probably in 2012, I think. Okay. 2011 or 2012 that I got hooked up with the BFRO.
And then that whole time frame between, let's say, this Lake Fontal and then the BFRO, that whole time, are you still doing Bigfoot research with your buddies, or?
Yeah, we were continuing to look into things if we heard about them. I remember there was a sighting, an alleged sighting, made the newspaper out in Maple Valley, Washington. Individual driving home from Boeing one night after work said that he came around this corner and saw a cow sleeping on the side of the road, and it concerned him and confused him, and he stopped, rolled down his window to look at this cow, but what stood up and walked off into the woods was a Bigfoot. So John Green had called me and asked if I would go look into that. And I did. My brother-in-law and I went out there and spent considerable time looking for this thing and looking for track. We did find just off the road, there was a piece of sheetrock. People had been dumping stuff all over out there. But there was a piece of sheetrock, probably like 4 foot by 5 foot, 5/8 sheetrock laying there. And something had stepped on the middle of that. And there was a big impression, but because of the way it broke, there was, and you know, it's hard enough material. There wasn't any definable toes or anything like that, but just a kind of the overall outline of a very large humanoid print was visible in the broken sheetrock. And so, you know, my brother-in-law and I, we went out there several times. We went back and forth through the woods and up and down the power line, and never found anything more than that to substantiate the report or the claim. And then I think one of the most interesting ones I got onto in the area of Puyallup called South Hill, there was a state trooper coming out to go on to shift one night. And then, I don't know how it is where you are, but our state patrolmen, they take their cars home with them. So from the minute they leave their driveway, they're on duty. Well, the state trooper had come out of this little development in his car and was coming down this road, and a Bigfoot crossed the road in front of him and then went down through this gully off the other side of the road and disappeared. Well, a news reporter who got onto this story and was talking with people in the area said that they were also getting these very strange vocalizations. So John Green had called me and asked if I would go out and follow up on this, and so I did. And the people that I met who had reported it to the paper, well, back up here. My uncle was a state patrolman, and I asked him to get a hold of this trooper and have him call me, because that was the easiest way to find this guy. So Mark something, I can't remember his last name at the moment, he did call me. I talked with him, and he told me where he lived and told me that there were people in this development that had been reporting hearing this thing coming down this power line, you know, periodically throughout the week. So I took a buddy with me, and we went out there, and I met with these people who had supposedly gotten this recording, and they got it on a reel-to-reel tape deck. They'd heard it several nights in a row, and one night the wife just set up the recorder in the bedroom window to capture it. So I took my reel-to-reel recorder and I made a copy of her tape on mine, and it was very compelling. It was a very high-pitched scream, certainly seemed to be much more forceful than any coyote would buster, but there were similarities in the overall sound to it. And we spent some nights down there sitting out along this power line, but one night we thought we heard it coming, but it never did come close enough to make any definitive thought on it. But that was probably an interesting one. It was my tape. It was my recording off somebody else's tape, the people who had originally reported this thing, and my conversation with the state trooper as to what he'd seen, that kind of brought all that forward. But that was a very interesting one, you know, and as a sworn law enforcement officer risks his career and ridicule by giving a statement about this thing crossing the road and about his neighbors hearing these sounds and these people making recordings. You know, that's pretty concrete evidence, in my opinion.
Absolutely. So you're saying these were audio tapes of the vocals?
Yes.
Do you still have those?
No, I don't. It was an old, you know, before we had cassette tapes, they had the little reel-to-reel ones. Yeah. Anyway, I sent the tape to John Green because I was working for him. So Cliff Barrickman might have him. As I understand it, he's in possession of most of John Green's stuff now.
I do know a little bit about this account just because I was like, man, this sounds really familiar. So I just did a little search. And so the state trooper's name is Mark Pettinger. And this is
Pettinger. That's
yes. And this is February 17th, 1975 and you may have seen a photo of a younger individual, a young boy, well, maybe around like 12, 13, holding up a Bigfoot cast. And it's definitely a 1970s photo going off of the hairstyle of the boy. But that individual's name is Mark Pettinger Jr., which I've always like, man, I've always thought actually looking at that photo, I'm like, I bet that guy has a really cool story, but I've never been able to find him. But yeah, that's interesting that just came up that's part of your Bigfoot past as well. It's very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
The only other thing that happened it confuses me to this day. I have no logical explanation for what happened, but a friend of mine and I, he wanted to go bear hunting. So we went up on the south end east side of Mount Si out of North Bend, where there had always been a pretty good population of bear. And he likes hunting clear cuts. I like hunting the woods. So we decided that between us, him going down this clear cut and me going through the woods, we'd stand a better chance of cutting track and maybe figuring out where these bear were going. And I'm walking along through the woods, and this particular patch of woods, it's all softwoods, poplar and alder and stuff like that. And it's just this deep, wonderful carpet of moss to be walking in. I mean, you walk through there so quietly, it was crazy. But I'm just probably, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 yards at most inside the woods from the clear cut where my buddy is walking, and we're kind of going parallel. And I stopped for a minute to lean up against this tree. Well, the tree was dead, and I leaned against it, and the darn tree fell over. Well, I've spooked out whatever is in here now, knocking this tree down. But I kind of did this stupid thing. I mean, I'm like 18 years old. I'm not the brightest guy in the world. And so I'm walking along, and I think, oh gosh, these trees fall over awful easy. They're all dead. So I walk up to one and I just give it a shove and it falls. So I'm walking along, go up to another one, and it's probably a little bigger. Thing's probably still, I don't know, 24, 25 feet tall, about 8 to 10 inch in diameter. And I give that one a shove and it falls over. And the moment that thing fell over, it felt like I'd been electrocuted. I don't know how to describe it. I've never had a feeling like this before or since. But it was almost like someone had run a ramrod right up my backside, up through my spine. I couldn't move. I was just kind of locked suddenly in place. I hadn't heard anything. I didn't see anything. It was just bam, I'm locked bolt upright, and I can't move. And it's panicking me. And I realize I've got to settle down. I've got to get out of here. Whatever it is, I got to get out of here. So I started to, kind of breathe forcefully, and I found that I could move a little bit. And my rifle was an old sporterized Argentine Mauser. It had a big old safety lever that flops 180 degrees. And so I flipped it up to half off, and I'm looking, and I'm slowly turning and looking behind me. I'm looking all around, and there's absolutely nothing there, but I can't shake the feeling. Well, in front of me, maybe 7 feet away at most, maybe 8, there's a vine maple, and vine maples, they oftentimes they grow right back down to the ground. They just make these big clumps. And I'm looking at this vine maple, and I can see that underneath it, it's moss. And to me, that vine maple was cover, and that cover was security, and I needed to get there. But I was afraid to move, and I'm slowly trying to turn around. I still can't see anything behind me. I don't hear anything else again. But to me, that tree is my salvation. So I just kind of gave myself the count of 3, and I took a big leap and then half a step and literally dove underneath this vine maple. And I landed on the moss. It was nice. I immediately rolled over, looking behind me with my rifle pointing out in that direction. Man, there was nothing. but I still had that feeling that doom was imminent, but there was nothing there. Well, next thing I know, I'm waking up. I'd passed out or fallen asleep, something, and I'm coming to, and I'm kind of doing inventory on myself and my rifle, and I'm looking around, and there's the feeling that I'd had is completely gone. And I crawled out from underneath this vine maple, and the world was normal again. The sun was shining through the trees. Life was good. So I continued on down and met my buddy down at the lower road, the rendezvous point, and I have no explanation for that, but I have since had other witnesses tell me that they have had a paralyzing fear only to then see a Bigfoot walk away from them somewhere nearby. And I guess I'm attributing that sensation, which I had never had before or since, to having been in proximity to a Bigfoot that wasn't happy that I was there.
Absolutely. I was going to bring up, I was like, I'm sure from talking to many witnesses over the years, you've probably heard details of that account in their accounts as well. I was just listening to you talk, and I'm like, man, I've heard similarities to what he is saying right now over the years. And also just the fact where you fall asleep directly after having something happen. Is it because, you are just, you have so much adrenaline going on, or is it, directly related to, maybe you did have, you definitely had some encounter happen. It's incredible. I've never heard someone, do you think that was infrasound or?
I do.
Yeah.
And years later now, those days, early talk about Bigfoot, infrasound wasn't even on the horizon. But yes, years later, I do believe that that's what it was.
Man, that's one of the most intense infrasound accounts that I've heard. And I'm sure there's some other ones out there as well. But I mean, wow, that's incredible, Rob. Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
Can you tell me the story of how you got linked up with the BFRO then?
Yeah. So, of course, the Finding Bigfoot show came on, and I've watched everything that I could ever see or find on Bigfoot or Sasquatch, anything that would come on TV. And I started watching those episodes, and I thought, well, some of these guys seem to be pretty legit. Some of their findings or their encounters and experiences are in line with what I've seen. And so I just sent in an email. And I got a response back saying they'd like me to meet with this local individual and talk about membership and participation. And it kind of went on from there. I met with Kirk Brandenburg, who's a pretty well-known guy with the BFRO, local guy here. And Kirk and I went out and investigated a sighting together. And I guess he decided I was worthy enough, or at least not a threat, and recommended me for membership.
Well, there you go. And the rest is history. We had been talking before the interview started, and you had mentioned something that sounds really interesting, something that you were involved with on the Olympic Peninsula. There was an investigation where there was a group that had some weird things going on.
Yeah, it was interesting. So, my license plates and my truck pretty well indicate what I like doing. I've got a Bigfoot sticker in the back, and my license plate is Squatcher. So, at work, I was a vice president of environmental health and safety for a multi-state contractor. And I drove my own truck one day when my company vehicle was in the shop, and one of the subcontractor employees saw my truck and asked me about it. And so we got to talking, and he said, I live at this place that is kind of remote. And in our little community, people have been experiencing things, and, let me talk around the community and see if they'd be willing to have you come in and talk with them and get some of their stories. And so, long story short, he did, and I was able to, or allowed to go in there. And they really are. I mean, they're not, it's not a survivalist, it's not a militia group. They're just kind of like-minded people. I think they're certainly not enthralled with the government, but they're not anti-government people, but they just want to be left alone. And so they've bought up all this property over on the Olympic Peninsula. And they lived behind gates. And I took my wife with me, and we went over and we met some really nice people who all had encounters around their area there, around their woods and down to the ocean beach off the other side of their habitats. So we walked around, talked to these people, and said to them, if you guys don't mind, I kind of want to go off down through the woods here and see what we can find. And that was fine with everybody. So my wife and I started off down through the woods, heading towards the bush, or towards the ocean rather. And we could see things here and there, little indentations that could be imprints, but nothing really terribly definable. But we got down to the ocean, and right where a river comes out and joins the ocean. And I thought, man, this is perfect habitat. You've got yes, there has been some active logging in the area, but you got this community that has all this property. It's quiet. There's nobody shooting guns up in here. They're surrounded by woods. You've got fresh water. You've got salt water. So if they want to go after shellfish and mollusks, they've got that going for them. If they want, the summer run or the spawning salmon or summer run steelhead, anything like that, they've got that river. It's a great place. And so with that in mind now, that thinking, yeah, there could be more, we started walking around the woods a little bit more. And we did find some very interesting trackways around the perimeter of this community. And we did talk with people that had sightings. One house that we talked to, something was coming up in the middle of the night, slapping on the side of the house. And that was very interesting. But I think the one that really got me was, again, on one of our job sites, one of our crew, who all do my pastime, said, hey, you got to go over and talk with my grandparents over in Port Angeles. They've got the craziest property. There's just weird stuff going on over there. So he set it up for me to be able to go talk with them, and great people. They had this piece of property on the outskirts of Port Angeles, but I mean, not really very far off the beaten path there, maybe a matter of 4 blocks off one of the main drags through PA. And I took my son with me, and we interviewed the grandparents, and then their daughter and grandson were living in another house on the property. And I think one of the funniest things that I was told was the grandmother wanted a BB gun to keep pests out of her little truck patch garden. So one night she thinks she can hear something outside. She's not sure if it's raccoon or whatever. She takes her little BB gun. She goes out the back door. There are 2 1948 Dodge pickups parked side by side. One belongs to Grandpa. One belongs to his son. They bought these trucks to restore them. And they're sitting there side by side, and she's looking, and over the top of the truck farthest from her, she sees a Sasquatch head pop up and stare back at her. In her panic, she starts shooting her BB gun at the Sasquatch, and it ducks back down. She slams the door, goes in, tells her husband. They turn on all the lights outside. Next morning, the son-in-law comes over and he comes in the house, and he said, hey, you guys got any idea who shot all the windows out of my truck? Apparently she'd never hit the Bigfoot, but she was breaking windows out of the thing. But that kind of cracked me up. But they had stuff going on. My son and I wandered back up this creek that just kind of aimlessly comes down from a mountain up there. And we wandered this creek, and we found the occasional impression that looked like it could have been a footprint, but now it's been washed out a little bit by rising and falling creek. We found some patches of deer fur, which isn't really unusual either. But these people had also told us that deer would show up periodically in the yards with a broken back leg, which sounded odd to me until, kind of going over some BFRO reports, there's been some speculation and some actual accounts of Sasquatch tackling deer by breaking a leg so the deer can't run away from them, grabbing them by the legs and intentionally breaking them. So kind of wondered if that was going on there too. There's an interesting area. There's this creek that came down off this mountain, and it wound around through all these little hobby farms up there in the foothills, covered over with brush, but a great pathway for something to be able to come out of the deep woods and come down and pick off, a shopping basket of food from these little hobby farms as it went along.
What an incredible account of Grandma trying to take out the Sasquatch. I mean, really just protect the property. I mean, that's fantastic. Good for her. Wow. Let's pretend that we're around the campfire and there's some new BFRO recruits with us, and we're just telling stories. Are there any investigations that you could say, I was involved with that investigation? That was pretty cool.
One of the most interesting ones to me. So I live in Snohomish, Washington, and so I'm really kind of in the foothills of the Cascades here, and I spend a lot of time up what they call the Mountain Loop Highway, which goes out of Granite Falls, goes up along the Pilchuck River, connects into the Sauk River and down into Darrington. And that's kind of my stomping grounds and research area. And a report came into the BFRO. These young men had supposedly been up on Mount Pilchuck, which used to, years ago, be it was a ski slope, ski area on Mount Pilchuck. And that these young men had, from a church group, after their youth meeting or whatever, decided they were going to go out and look for Bigfoot. And they went up this Mount Pilchuck road, and then there was a little side road they went up. And they were all sitting up there, and they'd get out periodically and, look around. These were just good kids, just out having fun being in the woods. And they got spooked off. They started hearing things approaching them. They got back in the car, and one of them said he saw red eye shine coming through the rear window of the car towards him, and then they decided to get out of there. So they reported this to the BFRO. My wife and I went up there to look into it, and I had just recently bought a game call, and I took that along to play with. And so where these guys were, there was an old access road. It was an old maintenance road on Mount Pilchuck, and it actually goes up around to the west side and then veer south. And it's all overgrown. You can't drive up in there. You can walk up in there. But Mount Pilchuck is a popular climbing trail, and that's something they do over in a little different area. But so we went up there. We got there about the same time of evening that the young men told me that they'd gone up there originally. And so I hadn't used this game call before, and I thought, well, we'll see what happens. So the first thing I do is I play the phone in distress call, and then I stop and I give it a few minutes, and then I play it again, stop a few minutes and play it again. And then I stop everything and I wait for about, I don't know, it's probably 10 to 15 minutes. And on my game caller, there's like the coyote reunion. It's a coyote pack all yipping and howling and one thing or another at each other. And it's the thing you hear when coyotes get together at night before they go off to hunt. So I played that, and all of a sudden, there were just this thunderous steps started coming down through the woods. It just boom, 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 boom. Excuse me. Something coming down the hill towards us on this access road. And I'm starting to get a little bit panicked about this because as far as I know, I'm the only guy there with a gun, and what I've got under my shoulder is just a 9mm, and I don't have a lot of faith in that. But I think we're going to be run over and eaten. Well, all this, everybody hears it. You can almost feel it in the ground. And we're all standing there like, what are we going to do now? I called up the demon, and it stopped, came to an abrupt halt just beyond where we could possibly see it. back enough in the trees. And we decided it was probably a good time to leave. And I never, ever did that again. And I don't recommend that anybody do that, because I think that, it's almost like ringing the dinner bell. If you're going to ring the dinner bell, you better have food that you're going to give it. Otherwise, you might find yourself in harm's way.
Yeah, and that's a great thing to say is on this show, there's a lot of accounts shared about, well, I did this and then I did this. Guys, we're not saying to do it. We're saying this happened, and probably don't do it because really stuff can happen. And if you ring the dinner bell, make sure you got the food there. That's a very interesting way to say it, but I think you're dead on. You had mentioned before the interview that you had some dealings around the Bumping Lake area.
Yeah. So I used to elk hunt in the early 70s. My brother-in-law and I elk hunted out of Bumping Lake, and no idea that there had ever been a Bigfoot sighting or report in that area at all. But we hunted the heck out of that place for 3 years. And there was a trail that went up to, at the time they called it Twin Sisters Lakes. I think they've changed the name now. It was a great place. I mean, there was an old mining town back up in there. We just never had anything happen. It was just a nice place to go. Elk hunting wasn't great, but it was fun country to be in. And then all of a sudden, people are reporting seeing Bigfoot up in there and having these encounters. So I took some guys up. My son and I decided that, well, he knew somebody and I knew somebody. We had my secretary's husband was very interested in Bigfoot. So my son and I took a couple of guys with us up to Bumping Lake, and we made a camp. And at night we did a little bit of a road walk. And we get up and there was a kind of a turnaround area in this road, and the gates were all locked, so you couldn't drive through there. So I just had everybody sit down, let the woods settle down around us. It was probably 10 o'clock at night. It was full on dark. And after, probably 15, 20 minutes of sitting there and letting the woods settle down, I said, okay, let's start back to camp. Well, my son's leading the way, and then the next two guys, and then I'm bringing up the rear. And as we start to walk, I hear this rock come flying through the trees, that sound. And it goes plop, and this bit of snow right out there in front of me. So we all stop and we look at this rock, and I said, okay, well, don't anybody react to this. And I think that's the key thing. Bigfoot will do things to get your attention. If you overreact, you just ended the experience with him. If you just react with a little curiosity or act very nonchalant about it, now they want to do more to make sure they're there. So we kind of ignore it and we start walking along. And we get probably, 20, 30 steps away from that spot. And all of a sudden I hear this, and I turn around and I look with my headlamp, and that same rock that had been thrown at me earlier has now been bowled up to me. And so I turn around and look back in the way from where it came, and of course there's nothing to be seen there. So, okay, keep it quiet. Let's all get back to camp. We all get back to camp, get the fire stoked up. And I said to everybody, I want you to stand up, put your hands out, palms open, flat at your side, and just turn a slow circle. Show that you're not carrying any weapons or anything. And so we all did that and sat back down. And it didn't take long before we could hear something on the periphery of camp going through the brush, and it just would make this circle or semicircle around us, and then it'd go back the other way. We didn't turn on flashlights. Again, we're trying to have a little closer in, positive encounter with whatever this is. And so for probably 45 minutes to an hour, it would just kind of move from one side to the other around us. And so finally I said, it's not going to do anything more than this. And I've had it. I got to go to bed. So I get up, I walk into my tent, and I'm just getting tucked into my sleeping bag when all of a sudden there's all this commotion. Well, it turns out this thing had come in a little close enough my son thought that he could get a look at. And my son's a big guy. He's, 6'1", 240 pounds of, solid muscle. He's a big guy. And so he takes off. This thing came around and he took off after it to get a look at it. And it was the sound of it running from him and him running after it through the woods that I was listening to. So anyway, he comes back into the tent. And I asked him about it. He told me what happened. And I said, look, please don't do that anymore. Don't chase the Bigfoot, because you might catch him and you don't want to do that. So, but that was there at Bumping Lake. And that was probably, again, didn't see it. But what was curious to me is where this was going on. Back in the woods, the game department had left a bear trap back in there. So it made me wonder if someone had Bigfoot encounters and they said it was a bear, because I've never seen bear in there. I've seen mountain lion in there, but never, ever have I seen a bear or any sign of a bear in there. So the fact that the game department had a bear cage set up right in that area was a little curious to me.
Yeah, that's very suspect, especially, listeners probably know the Bumping Lake area has had so many things happen over the years. You can go on YouTube. There's so many different Bigfoot videos and documentaries that have been made recently. So your son went chasing after the Bigfoot. Did he get a pretty good look at it then while he's chasing after it?
No, all he could see like the back of it before, it would go through the brush. And a tree limb would move out in front of it, and then how the tree limb swings back behind when you pass it. He said he could just see something as the limb swung back. He could just see this object moving away.
Man, that's like the gutsiest thing I've ever heard. My goodness, I can't imagine that. So, like, if you now, this is where I'm not. This is going to be a shocker surprise, but I'm not really an outdoorsman. So if you were, let's say, if you were to chase a bear, what would happen?
Ordinarily, they'll run away from you.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. The bears are pretty shy and pretty easy to spook off. Okay. I wanted to tell you something else about Bumping Lake.
Yeah.
My son and I had really an interesting one up there. We had gone up, just 3 years ago now. We just wanted to get away from town, go camping somewhere. And so we said, let's go up to Bumping Lake. It's always been nice up there. So we get there, and this area that we used to camp at when I hunted has all changed. And now it's all for horse camping. So they have kind of these elevated pads all over for horse trailers. And then, there's no toilets, no running water, anything like that in there. But it's really predominantly a horse camp. So we get in there, there's nobody there. We set up our tent anyway. Can't have a campfire, that's fine. We got a lantern we put out on the picnic table. And, we're just kind of having a nice time, just being together away from the hustle and bustle. And gets on to, midnight, maybe a little after. And I decide it's time for me to go to bed. So the ground we can't have a campfire. The ground, everything is just so terribly dry. Geez, when you put your foot down, it was a puff of dust and go up, a couple feet off the ground. So we just had a lantern set out there. So there was a spot, and let me back up here. So anyway, we shut down everything. We go into the tent and go to bed. About 4:30 in the morning, I wake up. I've got to answer the call of nature. It's still dark. So I go straight out the tent, across kind of this dusty bit of a trail, and go over to where this salal brush is. And I do my business, and I come back into the tent, and I'm standing there, and I'm trying to debate. I'm debating whether I want to go back to bed, if I'm going to be able to get any more sleep, or am I just going to get dressed and stay up. And my son wakes up. He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm just going to get dressed and stay up." And no sooner do I say that than right outside the tent, a great horned owl goes off. The hoo, 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 hoo thing, I'm right outside the tent. And we look at each other, hey, that's pretty cool. And said, hey, wait a minute. There's no tree outside that tent. And owls don't hoot when they're on the wing. So we quick like get dressed again, back out the tent we go with flashlights. And sure enough, there's no tree there and there's no owl. But where I had just urinated, About 5 feet to the left of me is a much larger wet spot in the road that wasn't there when we went to bed. And that's certainly not where I had urinated, but there's this huge wet spot. And going away from the wet spot and down through this Oregon grape stuff, I can't remember what they call it, here's these great big imprints, like 16, 17-inch long imprints leading off. And I know darn well they're Bigfoot because they go one directly in front of the other. You know, their tracks are typically in line. And it went one in front of the other, right down over the hill through this stuff and down into the area where there was another horse camp down below. So to this day, that cracks us up to talk about that, about the owl that wasn't an owl, and the huge wet spot that was kind of like, you know, I went out and marked my territory, and this had to come out and remark its territory. It was just kind of humorous.
It's extremely, extremely interesting. It's another, I mean, there's a lot of things from that account where you hear bits and pieces, and others you hear the owl, but also the wet spot. That is very cool as well. I love how you're able to have some really cool experiences with your son. In that it sounds like he was kind of into it as well, but you're at least able to get out there and enjoy it. The Bumping Lake area, you know, it's you're going a little bit south there, and did you ever do anything down in Skamania County?
No, I haven't.
Okay, gotcha. And has all your research and things you've been involved with just have they been in Washington, or have you done other states as well?
Yeah, only Washington.
Being involved with Bumping Lake, it is relatively close to some other areas. Have you ever done anything in the Packwood or Randall or Mount Rainier area?
Yeah, I participated in a BFRO expedition in Packwood, and actually that was my first one. Kirk Brandenburg had invited me to come on that, and that was kind of my get introduced and see if I like them and they like me kind of a trip. And it was interesting. The second day, people were still coming in to participate. And a police officer off duty and his wife were driving in, and he had a Bigfoot cross the road in front of him. And when it came across from the uphill side, crossed in front and dropped off the downhill side, he said it had reached up and grabbed this limb and kind of swung itself over the side of the road and down. So we did a recreation of that, and we got this guy to go with us. And so it turns out that, I can't remember who it was. It wasn't Kirk, it might have been John. Somebody went back and beat the brush for a little ways back along the route this thing supposedly came from. It came through this alder thicket, and there was Oregon grape and on the ground there. And so they were able to see where this thing had walked, but there wasn't anything definable. And then, of course, we were trying to measure to see how tall this thing was. And the only thing we really had as a measuring point was this limb that it had reached up and grabbed onto to swing off the road. And at the point where the witness said it had reached up and grabbed this limb, that was like 11 feet off the ground. So we knew it was well beyond human dimensions to be able to reach up to that 11 foot off the ground and grab this limb and swing. And really the witness's response and reaction to this all night long. I mean, here's a guy who's a police officer. I suspect he's faced some hardened, bad guys from time to time, but he wouldn't leave the campground, wouldn't leave the campfire, and he couldn't even turn his back to the woods. He had to keep rotating around, because he was quite terrified. His response was, I thought, very genuine, and that was one of the few times, I think, on an expedition that I saw someone have a valid experience.
What a first expedition. What a way to start that
Yeah.
out. That's very, very cool. Rob, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I do, we'll throw one more out there. This has just been such an incredible conversation. You are wealth of knowledge, and we've gone a lot of different places in the state of Washington in this interview. But I do want to ask your initial Mount Si encounter when you had that visual and it was behind the stump. Do you think that's the best look that you've ever gotten at a Bigfoot over the years?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was broad daylight. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And I guess we'll end with this. Spending so many years, looking into the subject and talking to people and going on expeditions, etc. Have you come to a realization about what you think these creatures can be classified as, or is it something you're still trying to figure out yourself?
I tend to go back and forth on that a little bit. At one time, I was firmly in the Gigantopithecus camp, but in the ensuing years, there's been discoveries made. If you want to look into it, look up Professor Lee Berger and his findings of Australopithecus sediba, and what is the latest one? Homo naledi. I look for an origin for Bigfoot, and I don't hold with extraterrestrial kind of stuff, but I look for where in the human line or in the hominid line could Bigfoot have split off and evolved separately and differently. And it wasn't until, I've looked at tons of research and archaeological reports and what have you. And Lee Berger has, in the past few years, convinced me, without intending to convince me, but he has convinced me that this goes back alongside of us, back to when we had finally decided to stop swinging in the trees and became ground dwelling. There are fossil indications of, Dr. Jeff Meldrum makes an awful lot about the footprint. And he talks about this calcaneus bone in the heel, which dictates how the foot of the Bigfoot rotates and where the flexion point is on this. Well, Australopithecus sediba, discovered by Lee Berger just a few years back, has that same calcaneus bone that Dr. Meldrum talks about. So is it a direct ancestor or relation to Bigfoot? I don't know, but here now we have fossil evidence that shows linkage between then and them and now and them. And then Homo naledi is his more recent find, and that was just, he just got that found and classified a couple of years ago, found in the same cave, much more human-looking characteristics. Now, granted, they were small, 4.5, 5 feet tall, but so was everything in those days. We know and can scientifically prove that Gigantopithecus is not surviving to this day. It could not possibly have because of the bamboo die-offs, and it was a specialized feeder. But I look to those kind of discoveries, and those two in particular, as being relevant to what we're seeing today, and maybe why we see so many is that they thrive around us. They actually seek us out for direction, for what we leave behind that they can use. That's my thoughts on it.
That's really interesting. It's a part of the subject I'm not extremely familiar with, but just looking up photos of sediba, and you're looking at artists' recreations, it does have some definite similarities to what you hear from witness accounts. So that's very cool. It might be something I'll look a little bit more into. But Rob, yeah. I just want to say thank you for coming on the show. Do you prefer to be an individual that kind of, well, I guess you have already said it, you prefer to be in the background, but yeah, I guess
if somebody has
yes.
if somebody has questions that they want help with and they think I can help, I'm more than willing to do that.
Okay. Very good. Is that a thing where we can share your email, or just if someone reaches out type deal?
Yeah, email would be fine. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I can put that in the show notes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, Rob, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for sharing different experiences that you've had and that you've been involved with throughout your life regarding this. And we'll definitely be in touch, but thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, you're very welcome. I've enjoyed it too.
Just want to take a few minutes to say thank you to you, all my listeners, for listening to the podcast. Please take a minute to help out the show by subscribing on YouTube, making sure you hit the bell so you don't miss any notifications, and share the episode on YouTube with a friend. Also, if you're listening to us on a podcast, thank you so much. Make sure that you're subscribed, share the show with a friend. Really, it's all about sharing the show wherever you can. If you've had a Bigfoot encounter related to the following or know someone who has, please reach out to me at bigfootsociety@gmail.com or pass on my email. Here's a list: the Duvall Lake area of Oregon, Rainbow, Oregon, McKinsey Bridge area, Sweet Home, pretty much that entire area, the north part, if you get what I mean. I'll see you back next time, listeners. Sasquatch Summerfest this year, July 11th through the 12th. It's going to be fantastic. July 11th through 12th in Green Waters Park in Oak Ridge, Oregon. And listeners, if you're going to go, you can get a 2-day ticket for the cost of one if you use the code BFS, like Bigfoot Society, but BFS, and it'll get you some off your cost. Priscilla was nice enough to provide that for my listeners. So there you go. I look forward to seeing you there. So make sure you head over to www.sasquatchsummerfest.com and pick up your tickets today.